Hello, I'm Caroline Hepker, Bloomberg radio anchor. We don't usually bring you an episode of the Bloomberg UK Politics programme on Friday, but the government faces the first of two major tests on Monday. Its first International Investment Summit, followed by the budget on the 30th of October. So I wanted to share with you an episode of the In the City podcast that I contributed to. I was talking to Bloomberg's David Merritt, Francine Lacqua and Allegra Stratton about how the city sees the first 100 days of this new Labour government, based on my interviews with business leaders, private equity and venture capital investors. Have a listen.
Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Earlier this year, before the election, the Labour Party seemed to be all in on its mission to be a party of business. We've covered it a lot on this podcast, the amount of coursing of business people, investors, time spent by the new Chancellor, or the Shadow Chancellor then, Rachel Reeves, here in the City of London. Everyone seemed to be convinced that Labour was different, that it was going to be a pro-business administration. But now, cut to just 3 months after the party's landslide victory, questions are emerging about how committed the party is to its pro-growth pledge. This week, we're going to take stock of Labour's progress to win back the support of corporate Britain and ask what's at stake if the city's leaders are losing faith in Labour's commitment.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The city.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Welcome to another episode of In the City. I'm David Merritt.
I'm Allegra Stratton. And I'm Francine Lacqua.
Later in the show, we're going to hear from Richard Harrington. He's the former government minister who published a review into foreign direct investment in November of last year. His review made recommendations about how the UK could attract more cross-border investment, and we're going to get his thoughts on whether the Labour government is taking his suggestions on board and what more could be done to tackle the barriers to investment. But before that, with us in the studio is Bloomberg radio host Caroline Hepker, who has authored a piece on how the city is now viewing the Labour Party's first 100 days. Welcome to the podcast, Caroline.
Thanks for having me.
So, you spend your days talking to business people, interviewing them on radio. How has the mood shifted from, before this year when everyone was thinking, hey, Labour is really making efforts to be seen as a pro-business party, to what they've actually done and what's happened since they won power?
Yeah, well, I spent the last few weeks sort of trying to ascertain that with a few key players. So people like Anne Glover from Amadeus Capital Management. She's key in that investment scene in the UK. People like Lloyd Lee from U Capital, working on one of the biggest regeneration projects in London. Phoenix Group, their CIO, they, if you recall, at their heart of the Mansion House Accord, trying to get pension funds to invest more in the city. Spent a few weeks talking to them. I think surface level, there is trepidation. There is anticipation about the budget. Mostly everybody agrees that in the first 100 days, which is what I was looking at, actually nothing much has happened. On the economic front, I think quite a lot of other things have happened.
I think one of the things that Labour had trumpeted a lot to business was, we're going to bring back stability to Britain. We've had weeks of headlines of freebies for government, turmoil, reports of all this infighting. Do business people feel frustrated by that ongoing sense of chaos?
I think there was such huge desperation for some new direction in the UK after 14 years of increasingly erratic government that, yes, I think there was a huge moment of relief, the fact that Labour has this huge mandate and a 5-year term. I was talking about a 10-year term. That's why I think there's a lot of anxiety. There is not just a huge amount going on geopolitically, but also domestically. And I think that, the people that I spoke to talked about the government having to learn on the job and how it's very difficult to do that in just the space of 3 months. And that's immensely difficult. I think it's put even more emphasis on the tone and the content of the budget, basically, that there have been all of these strands that they've talked about: infrastructure, spending, the National Wealth Fund, GB Energy. All that is a good down payment. but nothing's actually been done. That's kind of top level.
I wonder whether when you speak to, Blackstone, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, I'm not sure they're aware of who the chief of staff of Keir Starmer is. I mean, it's been 100 days, but I wonder whether it really impacts, someone saying, look, I want to put 100 million, I want to put 200 million in this country. I think they're probably waiting more for the budget to see the non-dom, to see the taxes, and where they land on this.
The issue, though, also is that the timing of the business summit it's been mistimed, right? Everybody pretty much was in unanimity that the investment summit should come after the budget.
And that's happening, just to be clear, that's happening next week, this big summit where the government is trying to pull in huge names from business from all around the world to come and sort of celebrate how Britain's open for business. But it's happening in this sort of grey zone before we know what the policies are going to be.
And weirdly, of course, it was a success from the Conservative era, right? The Tories did that 2 years in a row. It did bring in big announcements and also big global investors, at least to have the conversation about the UK. Right?
Yeah, and we had everyone at the time. You had a number of sovereign wealth funds, also from the Middle East, that showed up last year. It was very well done. It was well prepared. This year, when we speak to a lot of Wall Street titans, a lot of them can't be there because of boards. So they won't say it's because the budget is 2 weeks afterwards. But timing makes little sense if you're going to put a lot of money in this country.
And we've sort of talked quite pessimistically about the UK. But the other weird dichotomy is that the numbers are not that bad and that there should be more kind of optimism. I mean, we understand what the issue for Britain is, right? Growth and the lack of investment. Nobody knows the exact recipe for how to boost economic growth in Britain, but we know that, what the various levers are. It is the difficulty. What do you do on day 101?
In the first few days, their emphasis on planning reform was manna from heaven. That was what the city wanted to hear, wasn't it? And we should remember that they made a lot of kind of the right noises early on.
But also they just need to make sure that they have growth, right? So I imagine that every lens they're looking at is like, okay, I can get 20 million, private equity carried interest. Does that lead, if you make that higher, does it lead to extra growth or does it lower growth? I don't really know the answer to that. Like what you were saying is that this budget is tricky because they need to show the world that they're open for business, get money in. But actually it's understanding what can be taxed and not hurting growth. Because at the end of the day, it's not they can get money in, but they really need to grow the GDP of this country.
The thing that has emerged in the last week, 10 days, which I think they've let emerge because they realised that they were in a massive hole of kind of, you've been too pessimistic, which is this borrowing to invest.
Yes.
I don't know, but I suspect that was a kind of pull down from shelf, not in case of emergency, but in case everybody's grumpy and you need something to kind of shift the narrative.
Yeah, and I think the people that I speak to, they are all saying we are standing ready, like Phoenix, we are standing ready to put the money in there, but we've got to understand the direction. I think there's even more emphasis on the budget and on getting that right. And also, I kind of just wonder when she does stand up, you were saying as the first female Chancellor in like 800 years in the UK, can she actually deliver tonally that shift? That we are open for business, that we're going for growth. She's got to come up with some great phrases, to galvanise the nation, right?
Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thanks.
Now, as promised, Richard Harrington joins us. Lord Harrington is a former government minister who published a review into foreign direct investment in November of last year. We're happy to have him with us to check in on the recommendation he laid out nearly a year ago and whether the Labour government has taken any on board. Richard, welcome back to In the City.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, the review itself was launched here at Bloomberg. I felt very optimistic about it. Jeremy Hunt was very much behind it, and the then opposition, now the government were. So although a year's gone by,
Richard behind it?
Well, the new government was behind it in opposition and very, very much in favour of it now. And we're expecting an announcement on the subject because it's all about stuff which a lot of people think is quite boring, because it's not the most glamorous sort of Sun headline stuff, but it's reorganising the government in a much more favourable modern way for inward investment.
We've got the investment summit happening next week, and some people are saying, well, the timing of that's a bit strange. Everyone's really just waiting for the budget. There's a lot of nervousness about what sort of measures might be there in terms of wealth, capital gains, all these things. But what is your outlook for the investment summit? Are you saying we're going to actually get some substantive announcements ahead of it that are going to really attract investors?
Well, first of all, everyone that's not involved in something is always slagging it off. I mean, it's normal in politics. But actually, I think it's a very good time to have the summit. Yes, there will be some tax questions and things like that because people are, waiting to see what the changes are. But decisions are not made on the day. This is not something where someone will arrive in the morning not thinking they're going to invest and leave in the afternoon and think, oh, I'm going to invest now, or I'm not. It isn't that. So I think the fact it's before the budget is not relevant. But the government have, with a lot of effort, have put together a large group of very senior investment people from all over the world. I'm assuming so because these are the people that were there last year. They were the top people from banks, from multinationals, from sovereign wealth funds, etc. And it's a big showpiece for the country. So don't criticise them for the timing at all. I'm sure it will be a success because these things have the right kind of people in the room. But it's not a question of yes or no, because a lot of it just helps create the environment that we need. And I do feel an announcement on that day will be very important, Richard, towards investment.
What is the environment that global investors need? So is it, again, on paper, cutting out the red tape so that if a Blackstone or a BlackRock wants to put £2 million somewhere, they can do it in 24 hours? Or is it actually just making sure that the new government that a lot of people are still getting to know are really pro-business?
Well, the answer is both. That's a classic politician's answer, isn't it? But very briefly, the former. I found and we interviewed about 200 companies, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, etc. in the course of the review. And if I just go through what the obstacles were, and then we can decide whether Investment Summit's going to help. First of all, lack of consistency in policy. Investors, be they sovereign wealth funds or indeed companies, they want stability of policy and a very reason to believe that a new government, hopefully there for 4 or 5 years, irrespective of what party they are, will bring some stability. But beyond that, we've got a series of obstacles which were, first of all, money. There were pots and challenges and funds all over the place. Companies get very frustrated by this. What they really want to know is, if the government's partnering up with me in any way, this is what we need. You've done all the due diligence. I've either got it or I haven't. Then there's a whole series of other obstacles, such as connections to the grid, planning, skills. There's a lot of things like visas, etc. So by having a new organisation, which has been rumoured to be called Invest UK, I don't know what it will be called, it doesn't really matter, bringing together all of the different groups in government that do this into one unit, I think would help a lot, providing it has the power and the power of the Prime Minister to make sure that whoever runs this as investment minister and the OFI behind it has real clout to give an offer to a company saying, yes, here's a site we've found with planning permission for you. It will be connected to the grid. If you want visas, you'll get them within 14 days because you're investing so much money. And we're going to actually have a skills academy near you because we know you'll need thousands of new engineers or whatever it is.
But Richard, this doesn't sound revolutionary. I mean, it's just common sense.
I'm not a revolutionary person. Well, thank you very much. It is common sense. I think the investment summit itself is a different matter. That is a great summit, and it's just a good opportunity for the government to say, actually, we accepted the Harrington review. The previous government did. It wasn't fully implemented because there was a general election. So to give you an example, Jeremy Hunt convened a government investment committee, which is all the main secretaries of states. The first meeting had to be cancelled because the election was called. But I hope they will say, yes, we accepted in opposition the review. We're now formally accepting it. And here's our plans. And that, for example, we're going to have a greatly enhanced Office for Investment, which will have, instead of reactive powers, that is, someone comes to us with a possible investment and we scurry around, we're going to spread through our trade commissioners all over the world. We're going to identify what sectors we want to entice people and companies to come here, what we're going to do to help them, and sort out all of these obstacles for them. Other countries do.
Other countries do, but so what the UK is very good at is at least meeting, or number 10 is very good at meeting with a lot of these chief executives that want to invest. I would say people are still trying to get to know this government. They don't really 100% know what they stand for.
It's been this long wait, isn't it? And what we hear and what we've been talking to Caroline Hepker from Bloomberg Radio, she's interviewing investors, private equity companies. Everyone is really nervous. There was a lot of talk before the election. Rachel Reeves spent a lot of time in the city saying we are pro-business. Now there's been this long period for the budget, reading headlines about changes to capital gains, carried interest. What was this week was about a potential exit tax if you wanted to leave. All of this stuff is creating a lot of uncertainty and nerves. And people saying, do we really want to invest in Britain? So the government seem to be creating that uncertainty rather than dealing with it, aren't they?
Well, yes, you're right. And the investment summit is a very good opportunity that'll have the right people in the room and the right people listening externally to say very clearly, and I'm sure in the Chancellor's speech, not that I've seen it, but I'm sure she'll be reassuring companies and prospective investors precisely to get over those hurdles. And it's time that from the investment point of view, the government controlled the narrative instead of allowing all these rumours to come out. Having said that, investors are nervous generally. The world's in a difficult position. I'm sure other countries, it's not that other countries are brilliant. If I had £5 for everyone that told me that they had Macron's mobile on speed dial because he'd given it to them at some investment conference.
You've got his number on speed dial.
Yeah.
I don't actually. I'm a little bit disappointed
but
I
course,
don't.
But the truth is, I'm being sarcastic about President Macron, but I'm sure he networks very well. But it's the delivery that matters. And delivery sounds boring, all this organisational stuff. But what has happened in the past, we've had very good investment ministers. Take Dominic Johnson, who had the job for the last government, who's a very talented salesman. That was his professional life as well. They raise expectations by doing a really good pitch, but the actual delivery behind it was disappointing. And that's why the government's really trying to get to grips with this.
I mean, you can't be all things to all people. So what kind of investors would you want to attract? Is it sovereign wealth fund? Is it for, private public partnerships? Is it infrastructure? Like what is the industrial plan for this country?
Well, the government, I hope, will also be announcing the third. So one string is the new National Wealth Fund.
Right.
The second is reorganising the investment part of government. And the third is industrial strategy. And I believe the government will be announcing the chairman of the Industrial Strategy Council, something which Greg Clark and I set up under Andy Haldane. I think it was in 2016. Unfortunately, for some reason, Boris decided to abandon it. But I'm sure they will bring this back. They're pledged to do it. And what that will do, because people think, industrial, that means it's sort of banging pots and pans and factories. But it's a business investment strategy. It's saying, look, we can't do everything, exactly as the point you made, because, we're too small, don't have the money. But what we can do is identify as a strategy where we think we've got a competitive advantage. For example, it might be in I don't know, wing manufacture for aircraft. We're good at that. What do we need to do to attract other companies in that field, suppliers for the supply chain and everything else? So it sets out a strategy for where we can succeed and with what resources we have got, what we're going to put into it. And then the machinery, which I hope will be the beefed up Office for Investment, which I hope will be announced, then provides the implementation of that. So I think the industrial strategy or government investment strategy, doesn't matter what it's called, is very important.
I mean, just in general, Lord Harrington, I'm sensing a lot of optimism here that we are going to make progress with this government on a lot of the things that you put in your report that you have recommended, and a sense of continuity on the business environment. And that is, that's at odds with some of the nerves that we're hearing around the city. Like, what does the government need to do next week to really put to rest all of those concerns?
Growth is the big thing for the government. It's the only way for the government to be able to invest, to spend the kind of money they want on public services. There's no secret there. They can't put up taxes much because they're very high. It's got to be growth. And a combination of Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, and Rachel Reeves, the chancellor, I've got a lot of time for both of them, makes me optimistic. But they have to reset the agenda. And just a press release saying how great we want growth, etc., Investors are sophisticated people.
They overdid the doom mongering a bit, didn't they?
They did.
They've crushed a bit of confidence.
I didn't approve of that, but it's exactly what the coalition did in 2010. It's blaming everything on your predecessor, isn't it? Like that. But the reality is now people are looking for more than just the superficial messaging. And if there are detailed plans for the wealth fund, for an industrial strategy, and for reorganising the whole investment area, then I think investors will really come back into this country.
Richard, what about pensions? What would you do with pensions and pension reforms? I mean, there's an issue that not enough investors, retail investors, but even pensions take enough risk.
I think what Jeremy Hunt started was a good thing in the Mansion House Compact. But in the end, the only way pension funds are going to invest here more of their money is by having tax breaks on investing in UK companies. And I think that's quite a legitimate tool for countries to do. Other countries do it.
So it's slightly more carrot than stick, in a way, is it?
Yeah. Well, you can try the stick, but in the end, they look at the numbers, and if there's a big advantage for them for investing in UK companies, they won't do it out of philanthropy or charity because they've got the fiduciary duty to their beneficiaries, the people that have the pensions. So I would strongly incent them to do that. But I also think, I have a bit of a plug for myself, but when I was pensions minister, we did the auto-enrolment scheme, which is bringing more money in. And I think if they increase the amount that employers have to put into that, and the employees have to put into that, that will have a lot more funds. But they do need more incentives to get them to invest in the UK.
Talking about the climate, though, again, broadly, I mean, the bond market is starting to twitch a little bit about some of the messaging from the government. We've seen the spreads for UK debt widening over Europe, interest rates creeping up. That has all sorts of consequences. And of course, we've been here before when there were talks about big fiscal expansion under Liz Truss. I don't think anyone's predicting that sort of crash again. But do you think we should be a little bit nervous, or that the markets are starting to take note of things like the suggestion that Reeves will change the accounting rules so that she can borrow a lot more money?
I think it may well frighten Rachel Reeves off from doing some more of the more radical things.
56 billion
because
pounds.
Of fears of what happened with Kwasi Kwarteng.
Right.
And I'm sure she and her advisors were doing everything they can to calm the markets. But the reality is that a lot of stuff like investment in infrastructure is excluded. It's treated as capital expenditure. But a lot of things aren't. For example, housing, which is a very important part of growth. Money to housing associations is treated as basically it's a current expenditure. The asset side of it's not taken into consideration in public sector financing. So I don't think changing those rules.
So that's sensible to change that.
Yeah, and
why didn't Rishi Sunak do it when he was Chancellor or as PM?
Next time he's here, you'll have to ask him. I have no idea.
That's a promise.
Yeah.
We will definitely ask him.
You should. I don't know the answer to that question, seriously, but this has been mooted as part of the government's housing strategy. And I can't believe that will spook the markets because really, quite clearly, real estate is an asset. So if it's sensible like that, if it's just an excuse for more public expenditure, then it would spook the markets. I'm not an expert on it, but we've seen it in front of
But infrastructure investment, for instance, that would have your support. Say that's a good use of changing the accounting rules, giving you some headroom, borrow more, invest in infrastructure.
The more that public accounting rules are like corporate accounting rules, where an asset is an asset, a liability is a liability, and they're not all on the P&L. To me, I'm not an accountant. I was in business for 30 years, however. It's a very sensible thing to do.
What about the PFI? I mean, for those listening, this is a private finance initiatives, are these basically long-term contracts?
They are, and I'm sure the government is looking on ways to bring them back, a new modern version of it. Of course, like so many things in politics, in the end, the media, the populist media, brought down the last lot of PFIs because it picked out things where light bulbs had to be paid for 30 years at 10 times the price on Amazon. But I'm sure there'll be a big adjustment. But the reality of doing off-balance sheet accounting and bringing in private funds, I don't know why anyone could think there's a better way. I mean, to me, that is the ideal way to expand the infrastructure in the country. The tweaking and the rules, of course, have to be worked out in detail, and that's really beyond my scope to do so.
I mean, it's got to be appealing for the private sector as well, hasn't it? I mean, if you look at like the Thames Water situation, investors are very cautious about somehow piling into that mess, I suppose you can call it. Does Britain have the right conditions to set these public-private partnerships up?
As long as they learn from their mistakes. I mean, the whole Thames Water thing came about because of an ill-thought-out, phony privatisation in the past, where I think investment bankers probably bamboozled ministers and civil servants into doing stuff they didn't quite understand. If anyone's listening to this that was involved in that, it's not personal. That's what I'd have done if I was on millions of pounds worth of bonuses.
Really? No,
Yep.
You wouldn't have done that.
I would if I was at head of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or something, but I wasn't, so don't worry about that. But I'm sure a modern version of a way of working out partnerships quite seriously, just as the industrial strategy, the sector deals we did with aerospace, automotive, etc., have brought in a lot of investment. It's not an option. Some people on the right wing of the Conservative Party think that it's an option. If you just reduce taxes, that's enough. Government shouldn't get involved in help. But the world is not like that. We have to have partnerships between government and business. And quite what the mechanism is has to be worked out.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Great pleasure. Anytime.
That was lovely.
That was great.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt, Francine Lacqua and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi, with production support and sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer, and Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. Special thanks to Richard Harrington and Caroline Hepker. And please do subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.